I'm an original resident of Wisconsin Rapids. I grew up here and graduated from Assumption High School and was away for about 35 years, coming back 14 or 15 years ago to, at that time, Riverview Hospital to be involved with the cancer program. What I'm going to talk about today kind of interfaces with cancer, but I don't want to give you the impression I am an expert on public health. But certainly there has, in my lifetime of 67 years, never been anything quite as transformative as we are dealing with this pandemic. And I don't know that any of us would have thought a year and a half ago that the most common source of conversation over coffee would be vaccinations or the pandemic, and or a pandemic, and that's kind of the case. It's interesting to try to put a pandemic into perspective. For example, by the way they classify COVID deaths, in 2020, there were, as all of you know, in the United States, about 400,000 deaths. And that seems like a lot. There are, however, typically in the United States, 3 million deaths a year from a variety of causes. And just to give you a perspective from cancer deaths, in 2020, there were over 600,000 deaths. In World War II, there were about 250,000 people, 250,000 United States citizens who lost their lives. But in the world, there were about 50 million deaths from that. Probably one of the other transformative events in in my life was, of course, 9/11, and that was a little over 2,000 lives. So it is interesting to look at this and to compare these things. But I think all of us would agree that we want to have this pandemic over as soon as we can. And one of the things that I think there might be an agreement on this obviously politicized issue is that vaccinations fit into that aspect of trying to see if we can get on the other side of the pandemic. So what I'd like to do is give you some kind of a feel for how these vaccines have been developed. I'd like to just give you a little bit of a primer in terms of how these vaccines are actually constructed, go into the 2 vaccines that are available now in the United States, and then talk a little bit about eligibility, and finally talk about something that Tom and I were talking a little bit about just a few minutes ago, and that's what's called vaccine hesitancy. So vaccine development is not unlike pharmaceutical development, and I have some similarity to that because certainly when we talk about cancer, we're talking about a very active clinical trial process and the development of drugs. When I first started out over 30 years ago as a medical oncologist, it would be remarkable if there were 2 or 3 drugs that were FDA approved in a year, and now that number is up to 15 to 20 drugs. So, or agents that we use. So this process, and it's a similar process for vaccine, has 4 phases to it. One phase, and the first phase is called the preclinical phase. And in vaccine development, this is typically involved mice experimentation. And basically what they're looking at here is for issues of safety and also issues of immune response. But there is a phenomenon that occurs that is interesting, and that is called vaccine-associated enhanced disease. And in some of these vaccinations in mouse models, they've actually seen an active virus enhanced by the vaccine rather than depressed by it. So these vaccinations have to go through that preclinical trial, and then you get into the human trials, and there are 3 phases, which are phase 1, 2, and 3. Phase 1 is actually involving relatively small numbers of people. Typically, we're talking less than 100. And basically what's being done at that time is to look at varying dosages of the vaccine purely from a safety standpoint. If a vaccination gets through that phase, phase 2 involves typically hundreds of people. And in that phase, we're looking at safety. And I should say in all of these phases, they're looking at safety, but we're also looking at the immune response. Now, our immune response is quite complicated, but one aspect of the immune response called the adaptive immune response involves the production of what are called antibodies. And so typically what they're measuring are certain antibodies with reference to the virus. And so if a vaccination makes it through this phase, then you go on to the final phase, and that is a phase that typically involves thousands of patients. Just to give you an idea, with the 2 available vaccines that we have, the testing that was done in phase 3, and each one of them involved over 30,000 people. And these trials will look at the vaccination in a portion of the people in the trial and compare it to what's called a placebo. And what they're looking at there is something a little bit different. They're basically looking at the occurrence of what they would consider severe infection by COVID. And if a vaccination makes it through that process, then they can submit for FDA approval. This is a wild and woolly process now because of the pandemic. There are over 40 different vaccines that are in the process of development, and there are over 150 clinical trials. And I'm sure all of you know there's an anticipation that in the United States, we'll be dealing with more vaccinations than just the 2. I'd like to say a few words about the types of vaccination because this has been some concern to people. And both the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are what are called mRNA vaccinations. And basically, mRNA stands for messenger RNA, which produces a protein that is critical for the virus. And obviously, we're looking for the immune response to that protein. The protein you'll hear most about is called the spike protein. And what this is this is the part of the virus that actually attaches to the human cell, and obviously is critical for that virus infecting someone. This is a first-in-kind vaccine. There's not been a vaccination that has been widely distributed that is an mRNA vaccine, and some people have concerns about that, although the technology of this has been available for over 20 years. The other thing about this is that there is actually development in all types of vaccines to look at this. For example, there are 4 other basic types of vaccination. There is a attenuated virus process, and that's where you take the actual virus and chemically change it so that you can get an immune response to the exposure to the virus, but you don't get the disease. All of us are probably familiar with that process because that's the process that's used in the flu vaccine. Another type of vaccination is called the live attenuated virus. And this is where the virus is also changed, again, with the hope that it will cause a immune response, but without infection. This is a little bit more tricky virus because there are certain people in the population who can't get this because of fear of actually getting the virus. For example, the shingles virus used to be a live virus. And in the work that I do with patients who are immunocompromised, that virus was essentially absolutely contraindicated. Another virus in that category, another vaccine in that category is the measles vaccination. And then there are other processes to produce proteins. There is what's called the recombinant protein vaccine, which is where these proteins are actually produced in other systems, such as from plants or yeast. And then there are vector virus vaccinations. And this is where you essentially have a fill-in virus that has similarities with regard to these proteins that can be used for vaccination. And essentially, with regard to this effort for vaccinations for the COVID, all of these are being explored as possible ways of vaccinating people. So currently, we have two vaccinations that are available in the United States through what's called emergency authorization. These, if you get a vaccination, at the time of the vaccination, you should be counseled that these vaccines are not yet FDA approved. What it means by emergency authorization is that basically there has been testing to show that the vaccination is safe. There is testing to prove that the vaccination is efficacious. And there is a requirement that at least 50% of the participating people in the clinical trial have to be at least 2 months out from the completion of their vaccinations. Obviously, an emergency authorization doesn't answer certain questions, the most obvious being, could there be any long-term complications of the vaccination? But that's basically the criteria in order to get the vaccination approved under emergency authorization. So the two vaccinations we have are typically referred to by the pharmaceutical company that produces them. One is called Pfizer, the other is Moderna. They have more similarities than differences. As I said, they are mRNA vaccinations. And the important thing about that is that this particular type of vaccination has to be kept under what's called ultra cold storage. And so when they're taken out of storage, they have to be used within a certain period of time. And that's part of the reason why the process of getting the vaccine usually involves having to make an appointment and attempting as much as possible to be certain that you don't lose the opportunity of a vaccination by not giving it in time. At this point, the Pfizer is approved for people over the age of 16, Moderna over the age of 18. In terms of the actual side effects of the vaccination, what they've found is that the most common side effect is fever. That tends to occur in somewhere between 10 and 20% of patients who get either vaccine. There also can be discomfort in the arm. There can be generalized aching, mild headache. Those symptoms have been reported in these trials in about 5 to 10% of people. Another thing that's received a lot of publicity is the concern about a very severe reaction called an anaphylactic reaction or a hypersensitivity reaction. And the statistics are that with these vaccinations, about 3 to 5 people out of 1 million will have a hypersensitivity reaction. The reassuring thing that I would tell you is that there have been no deaths from an anaphylactic reaction to these vaccines. There are some details about the vaccinations that for some people will seem different from other vaccinations. Both of these products were tested giving the vaccination twice. With the Pfizer, they recommend every 3 weeks. For the two vaccinations for Moderna, it's a 4-week interval. Although obviously with mass vaccination, the question of whether you can give it exactly at those timeframes is a good question. And the recommendation is that both of them, if possible, be given within 6 weeks. There are remarkable few actual contraindications to the vaccination. The only contraindication is simply if people have had severe allergic reactions to other vaccinations. And that relates to the fact that most of these vaccinations are more than just the protein. They have other components of the vaccination to allow its stability. And some people will have a reaction to these stabilizing agents, the most common being polyphenol glycol in the current vaccines. Now, there are groups that are felt to be understudied: children, teenagers, pregnant women, immunocompromised people. But even in those groups, there is not a absolute contraindication to administering the vaccines. It is recommended that you don't receive any other type of vaccine within 2 weeks. And the other phenomena that is rarely an issue, but and this is available in central Wisconsin. It's available through Aspirus, and I assume through the Marshfield Clinic. But some of you have probably read about antibodies that can be given to people who are actively infected with COVID. And this is a process that's done for people that have a high risk of getting a severe infection, who are known to have COVID. And if you receive these infusions of antibodies, the recommendation is you don't get a vaccination for at least 3 months. An interesting phenomenon to some people is, should you be vaccinated if you've had a COVID infection? And this might be a surprise to some people, but in fact, the recommendation is you do be vaccinated. You might ask why, and the reasoning for that has to do with the fact that we don't know the length of natural immunity for people that are infected. And there is some feeling that the vaccines may actually have a longer immunity period than an actual natural infection. Also, there are variants, as I'm sure you're all aware of COVID. And again, your capacity to be infected by those is not necessarily eliminated because you've had a previous COVID infection. So probably the most problematic area with regard to the vaccinations has been eligibility. At the beginning of this, there was little controversy. The feeling was there were two groups that should be vaccinated. One of them was healthcare workers who were in high-risk situations, and the other were elderly people that are referred to as in congregated areas. Basically, that primarily means people in nursing homes. And for example, in Wisconsin now, with regard to those two high-risk groups, they are estimating that there's been about a 95% vaccination rate. But then it kind of gets to be the Wild West after that. And different states have looked at this differently. In Wisconsin, the decision has been made to allow the vaccination for anyone over the age of 65. There is even controversy about that because there are obviously different 65-year-olds in terms of their risk of developing severe COVID. There are medical illnesses that we already know increase the risk of serious disease, a serious viral infection. These include, in my case, people who have active cancer, but it also involves people who have severe heart, lung, kidney disease, or people that are significantly overweight. And there is also the question of, what involves a congregated area. And for example, in Wisconsin, there are over 4,000 assisted living facilities, And at this point, there has been what's considered adequate vaccination of only about 50 to 60 of those assisted living. So this is an area that will likely continue to be a problem. I was happy to hear in the conversation before this that the system at Aspirus appears to be going smoothly. To just give you an example, when the vaccine was first announced to be available for this tier vaccination, which was the 25th of January, the call center for Aspirus received over 7,500 calls. And anybody who tried to call at that time probably waited over an hour to try to get in, to simply give them their name so that they could be on a list. As I understand it, the Aspirus healthcare system has their capacity to give the vaccinations is probably about 5,000 a week. They're obviously trying to expand that, but their waiting list is over 25,000 people just in the tier that we're talking about over the age of 65. So this is a big task. This process I mentioned of the clinical development going from the preclinical to phase 3, typically when my experience has been with a pharmaceutical that we use for cancer therapy, that whole process can take 8 to 10 years. And phenomenally, these vaccines were developed under the emergency authorization criteria in about a year. I mean, that's a phenomenal feat, but it's also going to require a phenomenal feat to get these vaccinations in people's arms. And we know that there is a process that's called herd immunity. And what that basically refers to is that if there is a certain percentage of the population that either has had the natural infection, they've actually had COVID, or they've had the vaccination and developed an immune response to it, they actually cannot transmit the COVID virus. And if you get a certain percentage of the population that are protected, it actually can prevent the transmission of the infection to people who don't have that protectivity. Now, again, if you listen closely to the public health experts, that percentage has varied, but typically most people talk about 70% of people having to have immunity to have that process occur. And that involves a lot of vaccinations. I mean, there are over 300 million people in the United States currently. As of a few days ago, the number of people that had actually had their first vaccination was about 26 million people. The vaccines, I should mention, I wanted to mention it previously, but I should mention, do have a remarkable protective effect. So for example, for the Pfizer and Moderna vaccinations, if one looks at their immunity 7 to 14 days after their second injection, in the clinical trials that have been done, the protectivity is about 95%. After your first vaccination, there also is protection. It obviously is not as high. If any of you have gotten the vaccination, you've probably gotten the Moderna vaccination because that's the one that's currently available locally. And that actually has after the first injection, if we look at it 2 to 3 weeks after the injection, there's about an 80% protection from it. The last thing that I wanted to mention is maybe the most important thing. And I don't think any of us would disagree that unfortunately this vaccination has been politicized. And there is a phenomenon that is called vaccine hesitancy. And actually that isn't a problem only in the United States, it's a problem around the world. And to just give you an example, for 2021, the World Health Organization named vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 public health problems in the world. So there are a couple ways to look at this. You can, for example, some of the surveys have been written in a way where people are asked if you had a vaccine that was safe and efficacious and proven efficacious, would you take it? And there's a remarkable variation from country to country. For example, if that was answered in South Korea, typically the response would be over 80%. However, if you ask it in Russia, it would be under 50%. In the United States, the statistics are very interesting. Some of the surveys that have been done will put the question in a little different framework. They'll ask, are you unlikely, somewhat likely, very likely to take a vaccine that's safe and efficacious? And the numbers in some ways have been a little bit discouraging. Those numbers have varied from April until now, but have varied anywhere between about 55% and 70%. So that is an issue that I think is wrapped around the politicized nature of vaccines. I think it also is related to people's concern about other usages of vaccine, particularly in children, and the risk involved with that. So certainly I'm happy to take any questions. I just wanted to give you a little idea about how these were developed, the different types of vaccinations that we might see in the future, a little bit about the current vaccines that are available, this eligibility quagmire that we're in, and I think this very real thing that people call vaccine hesitancy. So thank you for this opportunity.
Ron, could you talk to the Johnson & Johnson and AstraZeneca? How different are they than this mRNA type of vaccine, or are they same, or what?
No, they are not. They're not mRNA vaccines, and there are a couple of things to say about that. One is that I believe the Johnson & Johnson one is actually being developed as a single vaccination rather than as two vaccinations, and they don't require the ultra cold storage, and that is obviously an obstacle in some ways to the number of people that can be vaccinated because of the sophisticated process required to get people to get the vaccine available and do it in an exact nature. So those vaccines would be helpful from that standpoint. My understanding is that preliminarily, their effectiveness is a little bit below what the Pfizer and Moderna ones are, but I would be shocked that they would not be available fairly soon, and part of the vaccination plan for the United States. There wasn't. Tom had brought this up, and I can speak to this a little bit. Regarding the moral or ethical issues at taking the vaccination. Certainly, I think for some people, this is a difficult issue to understand. I can give you a little bit of perspective from the Catholic Church standpoint, and their concern about this is the potential that the vaccinations are connected at all to aborted tissue. And there are different processes by which these vaccines are developed to the point that they can be tested. And some of these vaccines historically can go back to cell lines that date back literally to the 1970s. And And in some of these testing processes, there have been the use of aborted cells. And the question has been of if that is involved at all in the process, does that morally prevent you from taking the vaccination? And this becomes a very complex ethical issue. If you're talking about something that is literally 50 years ago versus something actively occurring now, the Pope came down with a ruling on this and indicated that he felt that the vaccines that are available are safe for vaccination. So that's what I know from the Catholic Church standpoint. I can't speak to other Christian faiths.
What about people who already have a compromised lung? So we're talking about people with asthma. How is this vaccine affecting them with asthma or already with, you know, heart disease or stuff like that?
Yeah, it's a significant issue because on the one hand, those are the people that are the highest risk if they get COVID to get a serious or life-threatening form of COVID infection. So you're dealing with that concern, and obviously in the opposite side, the issue of how will they actually tolerate the vaccine. There also is a question if people with significant medical illnesses, whether their immune system can respond to the vaccine to provide the same level of protection. But basically, and I can probably speak to this more with regard to cancer patients, the feeling is that if the decision is between having no protection by not taking the vaccine or taking the vaccine and dealing with these issues that you mentioned, in almost all cases, the decision would be to take the vaccine. As I said, there are the people that have significant allergy problems or hypersensitivity reactions or anaphylactic reactions. That's a different story. But most people with respiratory disease, I think, would be their physicians would want them to consider the vaccine.
Do we have the option to select which vaccine we would get? Like when it's my turn to get it, can I say I would like the Moderna because I've read that it's more effective than one of the other ones? Or does that not?
Yeah, great question. At this point, no. It just depends upon what vaccine is available. For example, in central Wisconsin now, as far as I understand, the only vaccine available is a Moderna. So the other thing that's recommended is that you receive the same vaccine for the second injection. That's being recommended purely from the fact that it's not been studied using different vaccines to provide the immunity.
Ron, when you said when they're doing this testing, you used the word long term to, if it's going through the thorough process. What does long term mean as far as testing is concerned?
Well, in terms, I don't know if there is necessary, for example, for the FDA to approve a vaccination. I am not sure that there is an exact time frame that's required or length of time for that approval to occur. I do know for the emergency use, it's 2 months. The other thing that I mentioned is just the inertia of going through all these phases typically takes a long time. And instead of taking months, takes years. And some people are concerned about because they think that if it's done more rapidly, it's not as scientifically sound. You know, I wouldn't want people to think that on a scientific level that necessarily corners are being cut. I mean, there are definitive criteria that have to be used for something to get from one phase to the other. But there are also, and some of you may appreciate this greatly, some less, there is a lot of bureaucracy in this area that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with science. It has to do with government and bureaucracy. And so the idea of being able to get through it fairly cleanly in such a short period of time, in some ways tells you how much bureaucracy is there.
I believe I got the Pfizer vaccine 2 weeks ago.
Where did you get it?
At Bailey's.
Oh, okay. I mean, that's a good point. There are going to be a variety of access points. The first access point actually in central Wisconsin was the VA.
Right.
And there are distributions that are separate for pharmacies, and I think they're going to become a much bigger aspect of the actual administration as we go forward. Well, really great questions. Thanks for listening.
Yes, well, thank you for coming on. It was really nice to meet you.
Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome to stay on and listen to the rest of our show if you'd like to. And if you've got other things to do, it was nice meeting you.